Mr. Aref Nayed, you are head of the Libyan Institute for Advanced Studies. What's the purpose of your visit?
The purpose is to sign a memorandum of understanding with the Institute for European and American Studies here, RIAS. And it's really to continue to build up back-channel diplomacy and think tank level discussions. I'm honored to say that the Libyan Institute for Advanced Studies has been instrumental with the help of some old friends like Ambassador Dionysius Zoe, of building the very first channels between the Libyan legitimate parliament and its government and the Libyan National Army and the Greek government and institutions. And we would like to continue this mediation work and research work and back-channel work to improve Libyan-Greek relations, and also to increase the capacity of young Libyans and young Greeks through mutual knowledge. We need to train young Libyans and young Greeks about our two countries and how to improve our relations.
So what can Greece do? There are several visits of politicians between Greece and Libya. How can this develop in the diplomatic field?
We helped...
in this very, very difficult period.
Of course, this is a very difficult period, and we worked very hard and had a very successful trip by the head of our parliament to His Excellency, the head of the Greek parliament. And in that visit, a very important statement came from the Greek parliament, in that the Libyan parliament is the only legitimate representative of the Libyan people. This is extremely important, and we can build on it. We can build better diplomatic relationships, and we can end the hijacking of the Libyan legitimacy by the so-called Government of National Accord in Tripoli. Greece is now dealing with the legitimate parliament of Libya, the legitimate army of Libya, which is the army of the parliament. And your foreign minister visited Benghazi. It was an amazing visit in which he not only saw Field Marshal Hafner, but also His Excellency the Prime Minister of Libya and His Excellency the Foreign Minister of Libya in Benghazi. This is very significant, and we feel that that, combined with the visit last week by Field Marshal Hafner himself to Athens, are all building up a momentum which is vital for our two countries.
But Erdogan was annoyed by Haftar's visit in Athens.
As you say here in Athens, polikala, that's really great, and that was the aim. It is not only to annoy Erdogan, but to counter Erdogan, which is more important. We need to build a consortium of people who are worried about the transnational ambitions of Erdogan and his neo-Ottoman dreams, and the tendency of Erdogan to not only support Islamist terrorism, but to actually use it as an instrument and as a weapon against other countries. He had the audacity to say that he's willing to agree with the Berlin document, even though he had just finished shipping 5,000 terrorists from Syria. They're mainly Turkoman terrorists of Qaeda and ISIS pedigree to Tripoli. They are now spreading in Gharian and Zawiya, and some of them even made it across the Mediterranean to Italy, according to some credible reports by Syrian watch groups.
Though inside Libya, who protects jihadists?
The Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood controls the Tripoli government, unfortunately. The so-called Presidential Council was supposed to be a 9-man council. It is now reduced to a mere 4 out of the 9, and the Central Bank of Libya is completely controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood, and all the oil revenue from the National Oil Company goes to the Central Bank of Libya, which is being used as an ATM machine by the Muslim Brotherhood and Erdogan, and that is why Erdogan is so interested. It is not to defend the interests of the Libyan people. It's not even to defend the interests of the Turkish people, but to defend the interests of the Muslim Brotherhood and pan-Islamist dreams that he has.
What about the criticism towards Haftar inside Libya?
In what way?
In the way he behaves inside Libya.
The only people who carry such a narrative are people who are misled by the PR companies that are being paid by Tripoli from Libya's own money. Companies like Mercury and Gotham have put forward the narrative that there is a legitimate government in Tripoli under siege by a rogue general or a renegade general or a strong man or a warlord. They all forget one very simple thing. Field Marshal Hafner is appointed by the legitimate, duly elected Parliament of Libya. He heads the army of the Parliament of Libya. What Haftar has done is to lead the Libyan army from a mere 200-man contraption into a very systematic and organized army that managed over several years to not only stamp out Islamist terrorist control of Benghazi, but also of Derna, of the south. And now the army is inside Tripoli. It's not on the outskirts of Tripoli. It's actually, let me put it this way.
Yes.
The chief of staff offices of Sarraj's army are actually occupied by the Libyan National Army now, inside Tripoli.
How do you comment on the recent decisions of the Berlin conference as the ceasefire is not being respected?
You see, when you say ceasefire or even truce, what truce? During the few days of truce, Erdogan shipped 5,000 fighters. And on civilian airlines, you know, and as well documented. He used civilian airlines to actually ship all these people. He shipped massive amounts of weapons, drones, anti-aircraft systems. So the truce has just been a cover for Erdogan to arm his allies. Now he can probably wash his hands off them and say, I have no more shipping to do, but he has shipped enough in order to make a difference.
Yes.
So, and they're already feeling out the Libyan National Army. They are the ones who are beginning with hostilities. The Libyan National Army has shown amazing discipline since it has promised to have a truce. They have not fired a single shot in hostility, only defending themselves at Airport Road and various other locations inside Tripoli.
Greece should have been invited in Berlin.
Greece, I recommended to His Excellency the Foreign Minister of Greece that Greece should be in Berlin. I wrote formally to the Foreign Ministry in Berlin to invite the Greeks to Berlin. When the Germans said that it was too late and then gave an invitation to the Algerians, I wrote to the Greeks saying, look, the Algerians were just invited, try again to get invited. We have done everything we can to make sure that Greece comes. We would have loved Greece to be there because prior to any of the discussions in Berlin, there should have been a prior discussion of two things. Declaring the agreements signed between the GNA and Turkey to be illegitimate, and secondly, taking back these 5,000 Qaeda and ISIS terrorists back to Turkey.
Yes.
Before we do that, Berlin doesn't make sense. And Greece could have been the advocate for such a position. Unfortunately, Greece wasn't invited. I feel that it's an offense not only to Greece but to Libya and to the Libyan file. But it shouldn't break your heart too much because Libyans were also not invited. And sometimes, you know, we Africans still remember the 1884 Berlin Conference where Africans weren't present but were decided for by the Western powers.
Yes.
Unfortunately, something similar happened in that Libyans were not invited. At the very last minute, they did invite Sarraj and Field Marshal Haftar, but only to ask them to name the 5+5 committee members, but they were not part of the session or the discussion. We feel that this kind of exclusion is not conducive to a realistic solution, and I think that a lot of how can you say, appeasement happened. Turkey should have been confronted a lot more in a more forceful way and strongly in Berlin. We're glad that President Macron did say something about the Syrians and about the agreements.
What about Italy? Turkey, I mean, is trying to gain allies. Is it possible to gain allies in Europe if Turkey is trying to gain allies like Italy?
Look, Italy was a strong ally of the GNA for several years, but I was in Italy very recently, and there is a noticeable change in the direction of the Italian government. They have been a lot more open to the parliament and its government, and also to Field Marshal Haftar. And the reason is that Italy itself feels threatened. As I told you, there are now credible reports, even acknowledged by Ghassan Salama himself, that there are some of these terrorists are actually leaking to Italy. So their aim is not to do so-called jihad in Libya, but also across the Mediterranean and in our neighboring countries. So I think that Italy already recognizes the danger of the Turkish GNA agreement and what Erdogan is doing. And I don't see that Italy would make an alliance with Turkey against the rest of the world.
What is the purpose of negotiation between both sides? What is the purpose of mediation when Haftar and Sarraj do not want to see each other?
Part of the mistake of Ansmil and Mr. Salam, and he's a dear friend and I deeply respect him, is to reduce Libya to two persons. You know, Field Marshal Hafner is an important commander of the Libyan army, but this is the army of the duly elected parliament, which also has a legitimate government that has sworn allegiance and has the confidence of the parliament. Not only this, and this is very, very significant, the Libyan army represents the will of the Libyan people, the social fabric of Libya with its tens of tribes. Libya is still a tribal society, and the vast majority of Libyan tribes are actually with the Libyan National Army, because it's the Libyan National Army of the Libyan Parliament that is aiming to liberate the capital and to free Libya's resources and money from the hands of the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's not about Field Marshal Haftar sitting with a single person called Sarraj. It is about the will of the Libyan people. Now, the reason Field Marshal Haftar doesn't want to sit with Sarraj is not because he doesn't want to sit, but because he has sat before again and again, and I was witness to some of these meetings. And in Paris he sat, in Abu Dhabi he sat several times, and unfortunately each time Sarraj went back to Tripoli, he basically implemented the agenda of the militias, the Islamist militias, and reneged on all the agreements that were agreed to before. And he claimed to be wanting elections and a civil state when he continues to withhold the money from the Electoral Commission, and when he actually is an unelected tyrant that has ruled us for 4 years instead of the 1 year provisioned by the Libyan political agreement.
As the first post-Gaddafi Libyan ambassador to the United Arab Emirates, how do you see the future of Libya?
The future of Libya is a glorious future, because the Libyan people are a glorious people, and Libya has amazing resources. It has an amazing location, and it has amazing neighbors. If we can only free ourselves from the stranglehold of Muslim Brotherhood control, Libya would make an amazing ally to Greece, to Cyprus, to Italy, to Malta, to Europe, and can be a gateway to the Sahel countries. Libya is an ideal hub, as historically from ancient times it was, and where trade flew across the Mediterranean through Libya. We can regain that position very quickly. We only need to get rid of Islamist control of Tripoli, and that is what the Libyan army is trying to do, not because of Field Marshal Haftar, but on behalf of the Libyan parliament and of the Libyan people and its social fabric.
So what kind of crisis do you have in Libya? Is it all about oil control?
Our crisis is very simple. It is about a transnational group kidnapping parasitically the resources of the nation state to use them to advance their transnational projects. This is about a new Khilafat. This is about a new Ottoman order. This is about a transnational Reich-like entity that the Muslim Brotherhood are trying to establish. The nation state of Libya is not rising for a very simple reason. Its resources have been hijacked by a transnational entity that does not believe in the nation state. We need to build Libya with fellow citizens.
Do you also accuse them for oil smuggling?
They don't have to smuggle. They're selling the oil legally, putting all the money in the Central Bank of Libya legally, and then taking this money and putting it in Turkey and other places legally. When we say legally, according to so-called international legitimacy of the GNA, when it comes to the Libyan courts, it's totally illegal. 17 judgments by the Libyan judiciary have ruled that the GNA has no right to spend a penny of Libya's money, and unfortunately they have been disregarded all this time.
So the disruption of oil production is the correct answer?
Look, it is like shooting yourself in order to make a protest. It is counterproductive, and it's against the long-term interests of Libya. However, we must understand that it is an expression of desperation and angst by a Libyan people who are deprived of the simplest of things, of their salaries, of cooking gas, of fuel, of basic medical services, while their vast wealth is going to Mr. Erdogan, and not even to Turkey, but to the transnational Muslim Brotherhood.
Thank you very much for this interview.